going to rearrange ourselves and realign ourselves. Those who are able to come here on time will be able to sit on this left side, and those who do not make it here on time will sit on the right side. And in this way, we will begin to divide ourselves into a moiety. In a tribal culture, the most important of all of the divisions or splits, the pairing, the structural faceting of the people is on the basis of a sociological quality, initially called a moiety. Within those moieties exist groups which are called societies. And those societies initially split off also into pairs, so that we will have a 4-part structure from now on for the next 2 months, and then we'll be able to resume sitting in whatever sequence you would like. But this is to ensure that you begin to get the feel of the power of the ordering which ritual brings. Ritual is like a deep comb, and it combs through existence, ordering it. And the ordering of the people by the combing is the effect of ritual. And so we'll experience this for ourselves. The moiety here will be those who arrive on time and those who arrive after the time. Within this group, you who have arrived on time, we will have 2 different societies. The societies will be on the basis of whatever book you are using for the year-long reading, whether the Odyssey or Moby Dick. And so we're going to pause for a moment. Those who are reading the Odyssey, I would like you to sit in the back row, and those who are reading Moby Dick to sit in the front row. So let's take a moment now and rearrange yourselves. We will keep this particular structure then for 2 months. Those who arrive on time will be seated here on my left, and those who arrive late will be seated on my right. This is purely to establish a ritual context of the way in which pairing increasingly combs through existence and nature, and that human beings as a group, the longer that they go with the increasing paired structure, the more that they feel the intuitive shape. And as the process of life fills by distribution the increasingly paired shapes, a pattern of conviction, of definiteness begins to occur. For us in our time, we live in a time where all societal shapes are being dissolved. In fact, almost all of them have been dissolved. And consequently, we do not feel the effect of ritual so much. And this accounts for shopping around to try and find something that works for you, because nothing works for us in this particular age. Jacob Needleman once, about 30 years ago, in a philosophical article in a journal called Mind, said the Western psyche has become a meat grinder, and that anything sacred is put into this grinder and ground up and becomes a sort of a gestaltless hamburger. And it doesn't matter what it is that's put in, it's ground up. And he predicted at that time, this was 30 years ago, he said, Zen also will be one of those things ground up by the Western psyche into just the hodgepodge hamburger of bored yearning for something else, anything that works. Because as we have seen, ritual guarantees existence by making actions efficacious, so that when we do something, it stays done. And you can count on the fact this has been done. And you can count on the method, this works. And you can begin then to plan out a direction for life on the basis of a method which works and results that stay. Now, this is very primordial. It has nothing to do with any ethnocentric particular content. It has to do with a basic bare-bones structure of existence. In this existence, for a human population of people, it becomes necessary on the level at which language flames into being. Language flames into being out of the friction of purposeful action, because purposeful action has edges to it. And purposeful actions in ensemble produce this kind of friction, and out of that friction, language flames into being. The friction is the rubbing of the edges of purposeful actions so that one has to say something, one has something to say. One recognizes that there is a need for communication. And as we've seen, the fundamental form of language is reciprocity, dialogue, communication, talking to each other, talking with. And so language at its most primordial, language is a different order from the level of just noise. Yells, yelps, cries, vocal interjections, all of these come on a different order from the order at which language occurs. Language always has within it this communication, the community of sound is a language. When we speak together. And so language, in a way, is a glue of process. Language as a glue of process. So that in a ritual, when someone is, as in the example of the Navajo, when a medicine person is chanting, is singing over intoned, cadenced language, the objects which are sung over achieve a vitality. They're awakened. For instance, here is a storyteller cane from West Africa. This is from Cameroon, and I use it as an example of the way in which myths are told among the people. Which people? All human peoples. The name that all human groups have for themselves, ensemble, is the people. We are the people. So when you see at the formation of the United States the phrase, we the people, it is an alignment with all human groups going back into primordial prehistory. The Navajo call themselves the Dene. The Blackfoot call themselves sixteenth. All of these are names which apply to people who do the same thing to live, who share a ritual pattern of actions together, and thus their lives are aligned. And in the normal give and take of time-space, of days, months, years, which Shelley once said are the rags of time. In the given play of days, months, and years, skews appear. The variety which is natural begins to tell, and periodically from time to time, the actions have to be realigned, have to be combed through, have to be brought together so that all of us, which constitute a people, recognize that we're coming back into alignment. We're coming back into sync. And by doing so periodically, we then ensure that we are free to have variety, to have whatever appeals to us, as long as it's paired with the ability to still come back into alignment. If someone goes so far out that they cannot be realigned, they then are an outsider, an outlaw, an outlier to the ship of the community. And thus they are let go. Or someone who achieves this kind of status, who is so far out and cannot be aligned. Generally, if they are young, they are put through a death initiation, because sometimes someone very special is unable to be aligned with the given traditions of ritual because they are to bring in some new ritual to add to or modify tradition. And so that person will be put through a death initiation prematurely. If they survive, they will bring something new into tradition. And in this way, tradition changes, expands itself, but within the laws of ritual comportment. For instance, one of the most powerful of all American Indians was Black Elk. Black Elk, who at the age of 9 was eating one day, and he heard a voice in his mind and said, "It is time, you are the one, you are to be taken aside, and something special will happen to you." The future, the far future of the people is in jeopardy. And you are the one who is to keep a special quality of the hoop of the people intact, so that in time this special intact hoop of the people may be brought to the tree of life, which seemingly will be dead, but when the hoop of the people in the special way which you alone will carry, when that hoop, that special hoop, is placed on the seemingly dead tree of life, the tree will come back to life again. It will flourish again. So that there is, in the very large amplitudes of life, certain cycles of seasons. There is a winter which does not belong to the winter of the yearly season, but there's a winter which belongs to a season whose year is perhaps thousands of years long. The general counting of historical people is by millennium, 1,000 years. Not by century, but by millennium, 1,000 years. And in all high civilizations, it was always recognized that millenniums are always paired. And so it was a 2,000-year cycle, and the Greek word for that was aeon. The Latin translation of the Greek aeon is eon, with an E. And so the eon came into Western civilization from the Romans that there is an eon every 2,000 years, which is approximately the cycle. The more precise Pythagorean mathematical cycle was the Platonic from Plato in his great late dialogues, that the cycle followed the precession of the equinoxes through all the constellations, and that the Platonic great year was 2,530 years, and that every 2,530 years times about 10, one had a complete cycle of something even larger than an aeon. So that every 26,000 years, there was some huge seasonal change, which normal concourse would never be able to discover because tradition never lasts in a recognizable shape for 26,000 years. So there has to be some way to discover it and find it by occult computing, by digging out into the nature of structure and recapturing it when that might happen. Whereas the largest seasons that can be held by a civilization are like the Platonic great year, about 2,500 years, or in Western civilization, every 2,000 years. In American Indian traditions, the American Indian traditions of our recent time, the late 19th century and early 20th century, happen to coincide, oddly enough, paradoxically enough, with enormous great structures that were very peculiar. That is to say, the American Indians who initially came from Asia came initially about 26,000 years ago. The first waves came about 26,000 years ago. The second wave, there were two great waves, came about 13,000 years after that. And so about 9,000 BC was a second wave, and of that second wave belong the American Indian tribes that roughly live in the northern part of what is now the United States and farther north. And they spread and leached in historical times down roughly to the border of Mexico. Whereas all of the Indian groups south of the border of Mexico came in the earlier migration and have a completely different blood type, different language structures. And those Indian tribes leached north as far as the borders around the Four Corners area of Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Nevada. So that the Four Corners area, not just that Four Corners point, but more specifically, the point was the confluence of the Colorado and the San Juan rivers. And the reason why the leaching of those more primordial civilizations up to that area, to that point, was that it was a divination point, where the San Juan River runs into the Colorado. The sands that are collected there have very distinctive patterns. They're very similar year after year. There are minute changes if one learns to read the pattern, which is the same all the time, long enough to see and detect the small variations. And occasionally there are great variations. So that those sands were divination point. They were a glimpse of the immediate future, this coming year, and they were occasionally a glimpse of the very far future, the next cycle of 2,500 years, something like that. And unprecedentedly, sometimes they reveal what is true for the next 26,000 years. That kind of cycle. The people who read those divinatory sands at the confluence of the Colorado and the San Juan rivers were the Hopi people. And in the early 1940s, the Hopi who went to read the divinations of the sands were stunned because they saw a pattern that was never seen before. And it took them a long time, many years, of dreaming, of consulting, of trying to understand what they had seen. And when they finally came to understand what they had seen, after a whole generation, more than 20, 25 years, they understood that the world as we know it has come to an end. And came to an end, the image that came out of the deep divination was a gourd full of ashes that brought universal death. And it wasn't until the late 1960s that they recognized and realized that what they had seen was that life was carrying radioactive ash that would end life as we know it in this great, huge 26,000-year cycle, 2,500-year cycle, immediate cycle. And so, like Black Elk, the Hopi as a people recognized that they had been taken aside and put through a death initiation. That they were chosen to do this, that they were a medicine people to all of mankind, all beings, all winged, all-legged beings. And so they sought to find a place to deliver this prophecy, and the place that they finally decided was the United Nations in New York. That it was the only council fire of all mankind. And 3 times they petitioned over a period of about 20 years to deliver this message to the world. And they were refused because the United Nations is a forum of nations, and they were not recognized as a nation on par with other nations. They're a subunit of United States. And even though here they're recognized as an independent nation, they were not recognized in the UN as having a voice. They did not have a seat, therefore they could not speak. This incidentally comes from no book. This was communicated to me directly by Thomas Ben-Yacha when he stayed in my house here in Los Angeles now many years ago, and we have it on audio tape. All of this is to give you an insight, a diagonal lightning strike. Why is it that this education is important? Because this education, from the beginning, reconstitutes all of the phase form cycle necessary for intelligent life. Because none of the past is ever going to be efficacious again. It has no power. It has no energy. Its language is already dead. The glue that it made is already losing its tenacity. And all that is before, what had held, is a swamp of dejection. A poignant disbelief that ordinary men and women are heroic enough to withstand the dangers of existence. A giving up to happenstance under the guise that this is cool. There are many profane words that men and women have for this kind of activity. I'm sure you have your own. So we need not pursue it. What's important here is that we are talking about, in this education, the way in which seasons of maturation happen in a doubled pair. 1 year's 4 seasons are bringing things together, integration, and the Next year's seasons are letting things go, differentiation. And it's as simple as a circle which brings together and a counter circle which lets things go. And as long as these are in balance, this is a spring of energy which maintains a sine wave signature that allows for life, intelligent life, to occur in whatever freedom and variety one would like. There are actually no limitations in terms of ceiling, in terms of expanse, or even in terms of floor. One can go as fine as one would wish to in any direction whatsoever, in any level. But none of this is possible at all without the energy wave that life requires. That energy wave registers as existence, and for us, it solidifies as our body, so that our body is the exact temperature, the exact location, the exact barometer for the weather of existence. And so all ritual has its focus on what the body is doing. Whatever the body is really doing, that's really what's going on. That's the actual ritual. There was an anthropologist named Edward Hall, who I think is still alive. One of his earliest books was called The Silent Language. And it used to be read 35 years ago in tandem with another little book by a Polish genius named Michael Poliani, which was called The Tacit Dimension. The tacit dimension, the silent language, the choreography of action has an intelligibility to existence. Life reads what we do and responds to us in that way. The only major modification of that law, of that principle, is that if we raise our actions to level where language indexes it, then existence must have with it the experience which language makes. And that language is the mythic level. So that the body wears mythic paraphernalia when it learns the power of speech. And so myth and ritual go together. We're separating them for educational purposes. We're taking 3 months of nature, which we've already done, 3 months of ritual, and then 3 months of myth. And we're understanding that ritual and myth vibrate together. And the way that their vibration stays increasingly tuned in spite of asymptotic developments of freedom and variability is because they are tuned, they're cinched together by a tuning of a symbol. So that our 4th season is symbols. So that symbols are like pitch pipe tuning for the harmony of language, and the harmony of language keeps ritual action in alignment, and as long as all 3 of those are operative together, they fit into nature seamlessly, and nature includes us, and wherever nature is real, we also are real, and what we do is real, and what we say is real, and what we think, founded around those symbols, is also real. And that the movement of the real has, like a sine wave, it has an objective phase and it has what we would call a process phase. The pairing of objective and subjective is somewhat delusionary, and we shouldn't pursue it too much. Process and object is better. In the process phase, of the real is nature. Nature is always a matrix of change. The illusion that nature is somehow statically there is an artifact of ignorant projection. Nature is never just there, but always changing. For the Navajo, the essential reality of the feminine mode of nature was changing woman. And one of the little quotations, which I'd like to give you, this is a book called Changing Woman and Her Sisters, Sheila Moon. Sheila was a wonderfully complex Jungian therapist in the San Francisco of the 60s. There were a number of Jungian women at that time who were extremely savvy about the intricacies of existence. Sheila Moon among them. I knew at the time Catherine Whiteside Taylor, who was not the author of so many books, but was an extraordinary therapist in terms of human presence. And Dorothea Hightower, Catherine Howe, many at that time. Sheila Moon writes here something which had been left out of the publication. This is a publication by the Guild for Psychological Studies, a Jungian publication. And somehow, accidentally, this paragraph had been left out, so they had to include it as an errata over the table of contents. And I always thought, what a fortuitous coincidence that one of the most important phrases in the whole book had been left out and thus had to be featured. Whole persons are changing persons. Changing, used in the sense of growing, expanding, used in the opposite of stasis. In the same way, a whole society can be distinguished from an alienated society, or even, if you will, a whole planet from a fragmented or anguished one. In an odd way, the polarity is a polarity between a premature death, which is a stasis of life, a freeze-drying of life, whereas in a changing reality of life, within that ecology, there is a death which occurs as a part of life and includes a return following that death. Whereas the freeze-dried stasis is an imposition outside of the energy of life and is a true death, as one would expect. It's a stasis. So that there's an enormous difference between stillness and stasis. A prayer is a language which combs presence to stillness. A stasis would never occur within that stillness. That stillness has a vibrancy, and that vibrancy is linked in a complete complementarity to the movement of life. And so life has stillness and movement together as a complementation. Whereas the stasis is completely outside, it is a true mechanical polarity to both stillness and movement. So one needs to, in ritual especially, to keep a kind of an intelligence, a cognizance, that there's a false polarity on one side of which is a stasis, which is an ignorant imposition. Whereas there is a true polarity, which is the polarity of stillness with movement. In order to keep this on a ritual level, because it can be confused very easily, the movement and stillness are always characterized in the ritual comportment as male and female. masculine and feminine. The feminine is the purity of the stillness of the center. The masculine is the pureness of the mobility of the surrounding, the boundaries, the scintillating boundaries. That kind of mobility is a quality of the masculine. The vibrant centeredness of the stillness, quality of the feminine. And as Sheila Moon points out, one should not confuse by idiotic pairing that only men have masculinity and only women have femininity. But these are universal qualities which play with each other in a reciprocity that is always in motion. So there are times when women are extremely masculine, there are times when men are extremely feminine. And one of those times is when the quality of the exterior penetrates by osmosis through the membrane of ritual and first enters into interiorization. The first step into the interior realm, male and female exchange qualities so that the male learns to become still and the female learns to become mobile. This exchange makes, on the ritual level of comportment, the osmotic membrane similar to a mirror experience, similar to looking for first time at oneself. And so that experience, because one has first experience of oneself as the other. Woman, for the first time, recognizes she also has masculine capabilities. Man, for the first time, is aware, I have also feminine capabilities. So that in the initiation cycle on ritual level, when the interior realm is mooted for the first time in a very big way, recognizable, usually this comes with puberty, the male has to be initiated into female world seriously because they are going to have a participation interiorly with that female world. They are going to have to be accepted into the female world on basis of their interiority. Girls are going to be part of the male world seriously and need to understand that they are not alien coming into dangerous situation, but they also are a part of that world on interior level. And so all intelligible traditions are sensitive to this quality of exchange. And what happens with the exchange when the interior world becomes apparent? That quality is an obverse, not a reverse. Stasis would be a reverse of the real including movement and stillness. So that stasis is a reverse. Or stasis is a reverse. You see how easy it is to keep losing this. This is why ritual cinches it by actions which one has to learn to do. And one of the basic ones, because counting precedes verbal and pronominal agility. Numeracy precedes literacy. One learns to count. One learns to keep, and so the hand becomes an index to the real in ritual. On one level, because one can keep track of this. One has to have a diagram, but not quite diagram, because diagram is an ideational construct that is promoted and, like a cookie cutter, recuts what is there primordially. Primordially, it's not a diagram, but it's an image of wholeness. That is to say, an image of wholeness is a primordial symbol, so that the seed of symbols are primordial images. Natural images are always images of so-called natural things. A tree, the image of a tree is the image of that tree. Whereas a generic tree is a symbol. The tree of life is a symbol. All natural images have a referent to nature, but the symbol has a referent to the interior realm. And because it's to the interior realm, the meaning of symbols is always obverse to the meaning of nature. So that the symbolic meaning and natural meaning have a definite relationship to each other, but their relationship is handled in such a way that they are mirrors of each other. And so the osmotic membrane initially is like entering into a mirror. Remember Alice going with her adventures through the looking glass? Lewis Carroll's great logical and mathematical genius showing in a very primordial way what happens. One enters into one's own looking glass interior and learns for the first time that the natural reference, which have always sufficed now, work the other way. They are not reversed, which would be the realm of stasis and true death and true mechanical polarity. But they work in the obverse, they work the other way, they work in a wonderland way. And so the sense that there is a, quote, logic to wonderland, which is obverse to the logic of nature, is part of the primordial intelligence of men and women on ritual comportment. In no way do they confuse the obverse symbolic working with a reverse of non-working or not working. Natural images work in such and such a way, and symbolic images work in the obverse of that. And so one has to learn to interiorize before one thinks symbolically. And the way to interiorize is to align yourself with passing through the membrane. And passing through the membrane is the structural skeleton of all rituals. All rituals begin with awakening the vibrational qualities of any elements, including oneself, especially one's body. Because until the body is awakened, until the things are awakened, until their vibration is brought to same pitch, where the alignment of the tone is the same, one calls that sacred. Only in a sacred alignment can one begin then to make the shift from natural image thinking to symbol obverse recognition. This is saying in a very complex way something that all primordial human beings did, and did remarkably well. I must say to you, not a single tradition that has come down to us did not work. The traditions that did not work were lost completely and died with the ineffectual men and women who tried to live by them. And they died out before the first ice age, some 200,000 years ago. Let's stop there. Language is a glue of process. Mythic language always has a cadence. The storyteller's cadence is kept by his stick. The stick of the storyteller is related to the scepter of the king, or the staff of the bishop. There is always this kind of equality to a myth, which frequently we miss because we are not exposed or experienced to the primordial. I remember in 1970 teaching in Canada and trying to convey a course on world mythology to a population of people who were unfamiliar with the primordial world. And so I included within the course a number of Blackfoot mythologies and brought in for that purpose the old storyteller. His name was Hanson's Bearpaw. And held the class, instead of on campus at the university, held it in downtown Calgary, Alberta, at the Indian Friendship Center. And there were about over 100 Blackfoot and Stonies and Sarcies who came to hear Hanson's Bearpaw and stayed in the course, as well as about 100 students. So we had a couple hundred people. And when he began to tell the myths of the Okan, of the Sundance, he went into the ancient cadence, the ancient form of the Algonquin language, to deliver his language in that cadence, ancient way. And so it had to be translated by his great-grandnephew, Hanson's Bearpaw, very old at the time, blind, almost like Homer, almost in the Odyssey like Demodocus, the blind sage singer. And his cadence was such that his great-grandnephew's translation into English was able to be woven into the telling of the myth. And after a while, after about a half hour, 40 minutes of this, what became apparent was that one no longer listened to the English, but one was enraptured by the Algonquin. The Algonquin language, in its mythic cadence told by old Hanson's Bearpaw, had such a power of veracity that one's attention was absorbed in that, as if one were absorbed or ensconced in a music. And it was not the sign intelligibility of the translation that mattered, but it was the pure rhythm of the myth that brought one into a wholeness like music. And one understood, maybe for the first time, I'm sure for most of the people there for the first time, not just of the university students, but of the Indians. For the first time, they heard a primordial myth of their own told truthfully. And one of those Indians who was there, a man at that time of about in his mid-50s, very energetic, a man named Rufus Goodstriker. Rufus was always the Hollywood Indian in productions because he looked like an Indian. And he stood up, his eyes misting, his enormous torso and muscles bulging, weeping in front of all these people because he had never heard a myth told truthfully in his native language, and something in him awakened. And he made a vow then and there to let his hair grow He said, I want my grandchildren to see a man in braids and to know that this has a masculine tone of integrity. What a transformation on the spot. Myth has that capability because a myth is a sacred language. A myth in its primordiality is a sacred language because it helps the ritual comb through, and all of the alignments are made so that nature, whatever it is, becomes selected by a pattern of the ritual. And this pattern of the ritual allows for the reality of nature to come through in a kind of a speckled way, so that the speckles make a gestalt which is a real shape within. The speckling effect is like a scattering, which the veil of ritual holds up to the light of nature, and the light of nature is scattered in such a way that it hits the membrane of the ritual myth, in between ritual myth, in between action and language. It hits that membrane in such a way, the place where masks exist and are real. It hits that membrane in such a way that the scattering effect of ritual is refocused by the language to an inner focus. It's just like the lens of a camera takes the ambient light and focuses it, but the focal length is not in nature, but interiorly. And so a ritual lens focuses nature in such a way that its image comes not as a natural image on the outside, but as an inner image on the inside. And one learns, as soon as that happens, even once, that there's a whole interior amphitheater. There's an interior space which is illuminated by the symbol, by the inner image. This interior space is the mind. And when the mind wakens, it wakens by invitation, by reciprocity of an exchange of the ritual focus to the symbol focus. And that the symbol focus is objectively as real as the ritual focus. The ritual focus is always the body. The symbolic focus is always the mind. And so a new pair, a tandem, is cinched and established and recognized by the language which holds as a glue the body and the mind, so that body and mind are paired and held in their pair, held like a calipers, so that body and mind now, for first time, are like a calipers that can measure, can translate into numerical and geometrical shapes the ambient movement of nature into the ritual comportment of ceremony. So ceremonies always have a geometry to them. They always have a numeracy. And on the most primordial level, it's usually in terms of fours or in terms of fives. Occasionally, on the esoteric level, it's in terms of threes. For instance, when one comes to a very learned book on ritual like this volume, paper reprint of Thespis, Theodore H. Gaster, who once was still read, recognizable, one of the great professors of the ancient Near East, the ancient Mideast. Gaster's book on Thespis is Ritual, Myth, and Drama in the Ancient Near East. And he talks about the way in which God types occur in ancient Near East ritual, and that they occur in a five-fold typology. One of the pairs in this type of gods is that there's a coronation type, a royal type, a kingly type, and paired with that is a burlesque type. The king and the jester always go together. Another pair is the combat type. There are combat gods, and they are paired with a god type he calls the comprehensive type. The comprehensive type and the combat type. The diagonal across the circle and the entire circle. That the comprehensive god myths and the combat god myths have a relationality between them. The royal and the burlesque have a relationality between them. And as a fifth type, there is the disappearing god type. The mysterious god type that disappears. One can have a four-part ritual where one has the comic and the royal, the combat, and the comprehension, and doesn't mention the disappearing god type at all. This is a quaternary. This is a four type. This characterizes usually the American Indian, Native American Indian. On a more complete level, when one needs to or wishes to or has to bring out the complete hidden structure, the fifth type, the disappearing god type, is brought into play. And there are times when civilizations have to be remade, not just cultures revivified, but when civilizations have to be remade, then a trinity, a triune, a triad, God typology comes into play, where one of the pairs is taken as a caliper and the disappearing God type is brought in as a third. This is like an alchemical, or as it's known, a hermetic tradition. This is a transformational quality which is brought into play. And this happens only when civilizations have to be remade. Then you get not only the king and the jester, but you get the magician. You get not only the hero who is there because of the combat type and the comprehensive, usually it's a wise woman, but you also then get mysterious sage. These triads, or these quaternaries, or this fivefold, these are the ways in which ritual distributes itself universally. The distribution is always by way of the language, however the language flows, because the language is the way in which a pairedness with nature is brought into play. We talked earlier about like the sine wave configuration, and that there's an objective and a process phase. And as this sine wave goes, if you followed a movement of the reel with both phases, the crest of it would be something like nature, and the lower crest would be something like ritual, where you would have a process and an objectivization, a process phase and objective phase, so that the body is objective vis-a-vis natural process. The body objectifies natural process. It's not polarized to it in the sense of stasis. The body is not statically here, but it's here by virtue of all the processes having a focus. So the way to differentiate, the way to make a distinction between stasis and stillness is that a stillness is always a focus. All of the imagery will be clear in a focus, where in a stasis, none of the imagery is clear. It has no clarity whatsoever. And so confused imagery is symptomatic of stasis. A human being who is unable to see the images which are there from their body actions are tending more and more towards a static death. They're dying out. They're in ill health. They are sick. The way that they know they're beginning to be better is that the imagery begins to become clearer. It isn't just learning how to visualize, because someone who is statically dying can learn mechanically how to visualize, does nothing to revivify them. It's awakening that vibrant quality of the way in which the body focuses life as a process, nature as a process, so that existence is the focus of nature. Why is there anything? Because existence is the focus of nature. And just as existence in the body is the index for existence, as the body focuses nature, a parallel to nature is language. And the focus of language is always the symbolic. And the symbolic embodies itself as the mind. So that body and mind are two objective phases of nature and language. So that language in its reality is like an ocean coextensive with nature. As much as nature is a matrix of change, language in its fullness is a matrix of change. Language is as protean as nature. And the mind is objectively there, real, in focus, as is the body. Now, if one is miseducated, one thinks body and mind are polarities, when body and mind are actually similarities to point almost of being twins. So that when one talks about a psychophysical continuum, one is speaking about this ribbon which turns itself twice. It turns itself once there when existence flashes into objectivity as the body, and it turns itself a second time, same ribbon, turns itself a second time when the mind flashes into reality by the focusing of images that have now become a word. So that what was an image in nature very often becomes the obverse, which is the word. So the objectivization of the mind, as we will see when we get to symbols, the last season of this year, the last 3 months, we'll talk about the mind, talk about symbols, how symbols focus the mind. And just as the body is a focus of nature, symbols are a focus of language in just the same way. And because they are a similarity, the correspondences hold primordially, so that body and mind can be tuned to any degree of exactness. Body and mind can be tuned in such a way that they flow without leaving any distinct trace whatsoever. There's no trace of the difference of them whatsoever. So that bodies can be purified to such an extent that they're like the shaft of an arrow, the head of the arrow being the word in the mind, and the body being the shaft of the arrow. And one can send this kind of vector into the universe, and the universe will always respond. How will the universe respond? The universe makes itself into concentricity of a harmony so that there is, a quote, a target, which is there. When one sends the arrow of time into the universe, a target like a future is reciprocally given. The universe gives a future, without which there would be no future whatsoever. Not that there's no non-future, it's just that it doesn't occur at all. Where does the future come out of? The future comes out of the mysterious reciprocity of the differential. And the target that appears is the person. No one ever found their person by integrating themselves, even if you aligned all of the rituals, all of the myths, and all of the symbols together. What you get with that alignment every single time is a vision. And that's what Black Elk talks about in Black Elk Speaks. When there's a special alignment, when what you do is aligned with language and aligned with symbol in such a way that there's this direct vectoring line, that line is vibrantly alive and calls forth a vision. That vision is the ambience, is the context, the focus of which will be the person. Now, in primordial times, that vision was often called magic, the magical realm, the magical world. And that magical realm was a third ocean, an ocean of nature, an ocean of language, an ocean of magic. So that language was seen not only as an intermediary between ritual and symbol, but in a larger sense it was seen as a fulcrum between nature and magic. And so language had a protean, grown-up version. In its child version, language links ritual and symbol, but in its adult version, it links nature and magic. And that the realm of nature, being this matrix of change, has an obverse in the ocean of magic. Now don't reduce it down. Don't talk about ritual magic, which you can see ritual magic is like a dog leg. And you can always tell when you visualize a dog leg like that that's a regression. Regressions never have a geometricity to it. They always have something flawed. Vision, which comes out of the alignment, is always like a crystal. It always has a crystalline quality of having facets which are ordered. So that nature, when nature shines through the crystal of vision, it always orders itself so that the light of nature is no longer scrambled, but is laser-like. Whereas a regression is always a fracturing, a flawing, so that the geometricity, instead of making a laser, what it makes is a scattering. But if one is not raised and matured through a tradition which functions, that scattering is not able to be distinguished from the natural scattering that occurs with ritual. And thus that scattering is misidentified as something that happens with effective ritual, and one becomes ensnared in a devolutionary downward spiral. One seeks then to find a hank of hair of the enemy and singe it in the candles of revenge. Holy ignorance, Batman. Now we live in a time when there is such confusion about all of these that almost nobody is able to tell the difference. It's not that there are no grown-ups, it's that there are no elders. In the sense of someone who has matured through the phase, form, flow of reality to point to where they are there with stillness and movement and complementation at that particular focus. What particular focus is that? Just as the body focuses nature, and just as the mind focuses language, the person focuses vision. Art focuses magic. And because they are orders of increased refinement, the appearance of art is a signal that vision has been experienced long enough to find its focus, which is real. And we know today, we can put a kind of a numeracy on it, that art appeared. The first art appeared about 26,000 years ago. Occurred in a great Pythagorean cycle, of which we are now at the first turn, at the first portal again, for the first time, have reached the beginnings of a new turn of great cycle bar again, which coincides, oddly enough, with a aeon, another 2,000-year period, another 2,500-year period, which oddly enough coincides with the generation of people who are alive in their maturity now. And so one has very strange experience, just like the Hopi elders who in the year after the Second World War was over looked at the confluence of the Colorado and San Juan rivers, at the pattern in the sands, and were shocked because they had never seen that before. When one looks into the arrangement of the stars, of the constellations that have been there for billions of years, they're different in very subtle way, which has never happened before on this planet. Never. Why? Because when one looks at the constellations that have been there longer than geologic ages, there are new stars in the heavens. The reflections of the satellites, some visible to naked eye, others have to be seen with telescope, but there are new stars in the cosmos that were not put there by nature. They were put there by vision. And so the constellational gestalt of the whole cosmos for this planet has been changed permanently forever. And no one can no longer compute by the old patterns because they are no longer there at all. They are changed, they are transformed in such a way they will never go back. They will never be what they were. And that's why there's such a thing as this education. Not to tell secret of new cosmos, but to educate how it is that cosmos is made at all, because that's the work that needs to be done. And until it's done, it's not going to be done. No one's going to do it for us. No one can do it for us. You can have most supersonic ship from most advanced star system. They can't do thing for us. We have to do it for ourselves. Otherwise, it's not part of the real. This education is the work kit. It's the tool bag that goes along with the invitation that there's not going to be any food on the table for the next generation and onward indefinitely until we plant some kind of crop of nutrition that can grow and we can harvest it and live with it. Because all the food in the larder from the past is all going bad. All the stuff that's stored beautifully is souring, is molding, is not going to be nutritional, isn't now. So it's a curious kind of situation. Seems like throwaway. And very often the new is not recognizable until much later, and then in a kind of a recursive way, the new is seen to be new. It was new then. It takes a while for it to hold. The resistances to this new have a characteristic. They're characterized by having no definite image whatsoever. It's like a time-honored quality of wisdom doctoring. The real medicine doctor for a transition like this recognizes the disease and can see the symptoms everywhere because they're remarkably the same. In Stravinsky's Poetics of Music, he talks about the new original sin. The new original sin is sin of non-acknowledgement. And one of the tastes of the illness, the sick person is unable to acknowledge wisdom because wisdom is now freshly new. There's no old wisdom at all, anywhere here on this planet. Nowhere. It exists nowhere. No one embodies it. No mind has it. If you bring most sophisticated contemplatives, whether by prayer or meditation, before stand of absolute truth, what do you see in your mind? Mind is exactly blank, where there used to be vibrant symbol. Why? Because they're not there actually in reality anymore. Whereas on testimony of absolute life and death truth, there were men and women by tens of thousands, if not millions, who had symbols working exactly there at those focuses of body and mind before. No longer there. And those that say they find something there, let them step forward. Let's have a dialogue. Let's hold up a mirror of actual process. Because the focal length shows nothing, because that's exactly what's there. That's why the resistances very often characteristically take the form of non-acknowledgement form, which is nothing in particular. The great French novelist Alain Robbe-Grillet wrote a beautiful absurdist existentialist novel one time called The Erasures. One recognizes that what is happening is that exactly at the junctures where meaning would happen, those shapes have been erased. Those focuses have been erased. Those qualities no longer happen. Those meetings, those junctures, those happy coincidences are not there. And it takes a while, and it takes a largeness of person to be able to finally wake up to the fact that one is seeing spots before one's existential eyes, and that the spots are symptomatic of starvation. When you starve the body, there's a process that kicks in after about 5 or 6 or 7 days where you begin to see spots in front of your eyes. It's because the cells are beginning to die out in the eye. And you actually, when you look to see, you see missing, they're like glitches in your vision. That's when you know for certain that the body is on a death process. It's heading into death. One of the first things that happened. It's deeper than hunger. It's deeper than the pain of malnutrition or starvation. It's an uncanny fearfulness that arises from the spirit. And what happens is that you virtually want to stand up, or do stand up, to go and tend to this. And it's very hard yoga to work with this. The best yogi of working with this in our time was Gandhi. Gandhi went through fasts where he maintained a spottiness of vision for weeks on end. I wrote a play one time of his great fast in 1932, the fast until death, when Gandhi actually was, for all physical purposes, already too far gone to ever come back into life. And only by just sheer yogic, karma yogic capacity was he able to reverse what was an irreversible death. He should have been dead. And brought himself back to life, not by the body was already too far gone, and not by the mind, because the mind already had vanished enough of its focuses to come back, but he brought it back by transcendent person. Showed he was real yogi. Because yogi puts the power, the indexing power of the real in the person, not in the body and not in the mind. And there are super yogis who put the indexing not in the body, not in the mind, and not in the person, but in the cosmos. Such a yogi is called God. Because there's a fourth objectivity. Beyond the ritual body, beyond the symbolic mind, beyond the art of the person, there is the divine cosmos. So that this energy wave, this sine wave signature of the real, has the body, the ritual body, as the focus of nature. It has the symbolic mind as the focus of language. It has the art of the person as the focus of vision. It has the divine cosmos as the focus of what process is that? That process is history. And just as Black Elk says in his great book that in his time, white men got lost in the dark of their eyes, so too, in a larger sense, our civilization got lost in the dark of history. And no divine cosmos was focusable at all, and hasn't been for a long time. When Nietzsche said God is dead 120 years ago, he meant philosophically that there was no way to focus a divine cosmos out of history, because history was so completely scattered at that time as to be unfocusable. Nietzsche wrote that about the time of Bismarck. And Bismarck is clear forerunner of Hitler. Not a Nazi, but a forerunner, like a little seed that grows up to be very large poisonous weed. Bismarck is recognizable as a seed. In order to teach the French how to behave correctly, Bismarck walked in with his armies and took over Paris, rearranged the city in the way in which the Germans thought it should be arranged, and then marched out, saying, well, now they will behave like good people should. This was in 1870. And so, of course, the Kaiser in the First World War said, they're still misbehaving. We must march back in and teach them how to behave. And the same thing happened in the Second World War. And so one can see that history has become an improbable swampland and cannot be dealt with at all, because there is no one home to deal with it. There are not enough people, not enough persons who are real to deal with the enormity of navigating the ocean of history. And the reason for this is because the mind, the symbolic mind, is not focused enough to permit the further maturation of conscious differential people. And that's true because the bodies are now so scrambled as to not permit mind to even come into any kind of a focus. All this is true because of the dissolving of all the great reciprocal relationalities that constitute the pattern and the rhythm of the real. This is the condition. This is the very quality that's here. The inability to distinguish between myth and vision, for instance, leads some great speakers to talk about the myth of the hero, when actually the hero is a gestalt in the realm of vision and not in myth. We'll talk about this when we get into mythology in about 3 months. Our focus today is on the way in which ritual comportment is a link. It has its correspondence. And its correspondence is not with nature. Its correspondence is not with myth. The deeper correspondence of ritual is with mind. So that ritual actions have a similarity with interior images. So that ritual actions and interior images vibrate together. One occasionally will have the experience where with a right shiatsu or right acupuncture, images will come up out of the body. In traditional cultures that are healthy, when men and women are dancing their ritual dances together, the mind comes alive with inner images. These inner images are the correspondence with the actions that are necessary for life. And so by tuning the actions with the inner images, one then tunes ritual and psyche together, and the flow of life energy becomes aligned. This has nothing to do with being primitive. It has everything to do with being real. So one of the great women anthropologists from that American school, that Gladys Reichard, who wrote one of our texts, one of our pairs of books, The Pair with Black Elk Speaks, or with Black Elk's 7 Rites of the Oglala Sioux. One of the women there, Ruth Underhill, wrote a book with the title Gods That Dance. Gods That Dance. Because it's in the ritual dance that the interiorization wakens and the images of the divine for the first time come alive. Do we know of anyone else who danced before the divine with all his might? Well, I think we do. David. King David. The dance is the way in which the community of bodies is brought into an aligned movement with the rhythm that is the substrate of the cadence of sacred language. The dance always has an alignment with the rhythm of the cadence of the myth. It is the telling of the myth that is the music of the ritual. And if the myth is mistold, the ritual steps are wrong. Even if you know the right ones, you don't do them right. They're not done right. And so the chanting of prayers always must accompany ritual action. If they're not aligned, then the prayers become increasingly fictive without you knowing it, without anyone knowing it. And the ritual actions become regressive without anyone getting wise to it. And in this kind of devolution, there is a reductiveness that is not able to be caught because the discerning differential consciousness is never even awakened. And one calls such people asleep. Thus, the clarion call classically to vision is to wake up. But in order for the mind to wake up, it has to be able to hear such a call. And the language for such a call can only come from actions that are aligned with natural mystery. And so the very first level of tuning to the real is to focus on what we're doing. Does it have anything at all to do with nature? Because if our actions, if our ritual comportment has nothing at all to do with nature, then it has to do with something fictive. And the difference between fiction and nature is not discernible by the mind. It's not the function of the mind to make that distinction. It's the function of the body. And the way the body makes that distinction is that it's either healthy or it's diseased, dis-ease. And so anxiety is the first indication in a body that it's not right. The body feels it's not right. Something is not right. What it is has yet to be discovered. And it's this nervousness, it's this anxiety, which to primordial peoples characterized the colonial Europeans who came like a plague over their worlds. Always restless, never in stillness, never in real vitality, but always restless unto, Kierkegaard's great phrase was the sickness unto death. And he called that sickness unto death recognizable because the symptoms were fear and trembling, nervous agitation. And that fear and trembling, that sickness unto death, was characteristic. Kierkegaard wrote those works in the 1830s, 1840s, 150 years ago. Already by then had set in to such an extent that it was noticeable, was even able to be diagnosed. The ritual comportment, by setting up truthful reciprocity, allows for the body to increasingly tells whether it is uneasy or not, whether it has a harmony within it or not. Because if the reciprocities are complete, one gets the sense, the bodily sense of balance. And that sense of bodily balance allows one to have dance movements that are free. American Indian saying was, never trust a man who doesn't dance with his people. Because very often it's the men who don't dance that are the first casualties in delusion. Because they lose the first line of defense, the first smarts about going sour, about going bitter. Because the first sourness, the first bitterness, is that your dance movements are off. Your body doesn't freely respond to the drum. And when your body doesn't freely respond to the drum, you're already farther gone than your mind could correct. No amount of thought is a therapy at that point. And it's useless to argue or to give philosophy to such a sick person. So where does ritual begin? Ritual always begins with an awakening to an attunement And this awakening is the singing over, is the chanting over of each object that's going to be involved in a ritual. So that the ritual gestalt is going to be made of living objects, of, quote, things brought to the vibration of vitality. And something that cannot be woken up must be looked at then as a product of death and dealt with accordingly. There are stones that cannot be woke up. There are feathers that cannot be woke up. They are not to be used. There are persons who cannot now be woken up at this time. They are not to participate. There are colors that are not woken up at this time. They are not to be used. If they're essential, the ritual will not be held. The vitality of a sacred object is extraordinary. A real primordial sacred object is extraordinary. One of my personal lineages comes from the Algonquin Indians. I was adopted by a spirit mother, who in her turn was adopted by a spirit father, who was in his turn had been adopted by a spirit father. And that spirit mother, when she was dying in her 80s, brought out a wrapped bundle. In Algonquin language, it's called a natoas, sacred bundle that had belonged to her spirit father, who was the great medicine man of the Blackfoot Stony Indians. His name was Tatanga Mani, walking buffalo, who died at the age of 97. And when he died in late 1960s, and the National Museum of Canada was taking all ancient sacred ritual objects and putting them into museums for safekeeping. And of course, when you put them into museums for safekeeping, you take them out of nature, which makes them lose their efficacy, their sacredness. And because it takes 4 medicine men to make a sacred implement in the Algonquin culture, the Blackfoot Nation had lost all of their sacred objects to museums, except this one natoas, this one sacred bundle. And so it was my spirit mother's responsibility to preserve its sacredness by not allowing it to be given to a museum, and asked me what to do with it because I was her son spiritually. And I said, in order to ensure that there be something there for the people at some unknown time, in some variation of the future that could not be seen, because anyone who sees distant future now is lying, because there's no distant future there to see at all. It will be there if we live, if we proceed to live. Otherwise, there's nothing there at all. And so I suggested burying it in a place where it would be safe. And I asked to see the contents of the natoas before it was buried. And we did and duly bury it, and it will never be found. It'll always be sacred. In the bundle, the center of the bundle, among other paraphernalia, nestled in a buffalo head, because his name, Tatangamani, buffalo head, not a skull, but the head of the buffalo, where the reddish hair in between the blackened horns was still vibrant over, at that time, 80 to 90 years from when he had gotten it. And nestled into that buffalo head was the sacred rattle. And the rattle was made of a buffalo's scrotum, so that the dried testes made the sound of the rattle. And that rattle was the awakening of the interiority of the buffalo. And so it was always nestled in there. And in order to preserve that, all of that was buried. in a ritual, if you do not have awakened implements, they in turn cannot awaken. For instance, in the great Hellenistic mysteries, the awakening ritual item was not the buffalo scrotum rattle, but was a handheld implement called a sistrum that could only be held by sacred women. Only sacred women could hold it, and it was an Isis implement. And what the sistrum did is it played a dissonant chord that scrambled all sound, all extant sound, so that extant forms, oral, audio forms, could not hold themselves. So that no matter what profaned form was taking place in an audible way, the sistrum scrambled that so that someone else bringing in a pitch pipe based on a Pythagorean harmonic could sound that, and out of the scrambled, scattered sound could reassemble the ordered sound of sacred intonation. So in Hellenistic mystery rituals, the sistrum always came first, and then the music pitch pipe would intone, and the octave, which is pairing 3 times, 2 paired to 4 and 4 paired to 8, so that the musical scale of the Pythagorean was always an octave, an 8-note scale. And the 8-note scale was sealed because the last note was the same as the first note, except it was on the next order above. So that the octave is always a kind of spiral, the opening of which is exactly to the calibration of 1 level above, 1 octave above, 1 octave. And this symbol, when one sees this symbol, it looks visually, when one sees it in one's mind, the mind purified sees this symbol as a flattened spiral of 1 rotation. So it's 1, spiritually envisioned as a spiral which has been flattened so that the increment is exactly 1 octave, 1 element above. So that the curve of the spiral is a 7-part, 7-fold curve, and the 8th is exactly 1/8 above the curve of the 7. This particular symbol is a universal symbol and has been used many times, and one finds it in mystical paintings, in mystical art around the world, and at some future time in the course we'll talk about it. And when one sees that, you can recognize that this is from the Western Pythagorean Hermetic tradition. All Western music is based upon that. The only difference from that is the 12-tone scale developed by Schoenberg and Anton Webern and so forth at the beginning of the 20th century. It's interesting that the music that's used at this particular time in our course, in our development, the music that goes with the ritual season is Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. The Rite of Spring is Stravinsky, who recognizes that there is a kind of a 12-tone possibility, but uses a scrambling of the ancient octave, but reestablishes a new kind of octave on basis of driving rhythm. And when one listens to Rite of Spring, even some 80 years after its first performance, it still has ability to jar. Even in an age that's already a generation after Jimi Hendrix, it still has ability to jar. It absolutely offended everyone in Paris. It absolutely entranced everyone in London. The reasons for that are quite interesting, and at some time we'll go into that. When we do art, we use Stravinsky's Poetics of Music, and we'll talk about Stravinsky more at that time. For now, if you will listen to the music which came at the interval, which was Gregorian chant, and then you listen to Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, one right after the other, you will get the message in music of the way in which nature changes gear into ritual, and how ritual is always carried by a driving rhythm which has within it a pattern that's folded so tight that it comes across as a drum beat. But the drum beat, the rhythm, can be modulated in such a way that it's opening in syncopation. Syncopation is pairing of rhythm. If you open the syncopation, a kind of a form, it's almost like a fugue form, occurs in which the melodic line of music distributes itself into a tonality which is recognizably classic Pythagorean octave. It's an extraordinary experience to have. One has to only take one's hat off to the young Stravinsky for being an incredible genius on vast scale to be able to hear this, and still wear his polished two-tone shoes and spats and look like a dandy when actually he was an old medicine man, ancient shaman, who felt most at home when he was around shamanic dancers in their ritual costumes called ballet. And when he was with the ballet people in all of their costumes, all of his juices got going, and the old medicine man came out in modern, early 20th century style vision. Before the ballet, Stravinsky was very much traditional composer. And as soon as he got exposed to ritual comportment of ballet russe, all of a sudden, Paris was alive in a way in which the Impressionists had said it was alive. That the art of the person was something completely new, had not been seen before. And Stravinsky's music, like Monet's paintings, did a speckled spattering of nature in such a way that it created new impressions on the mind. That's where the word impressionist came from Monet, who said, if you will look at nature through my canvases, something in you will register. Those impressions have something to do with a new kind of person. Without knowing that particular sequence and how it vibrates together, how its similarity, correspondence is energized, one cannot see in the vision. And as soon as you get some capacity to see in that vision, one sees Monet in the way in which Renoir saw Monet. He saw it exactly à la Monet, and tipped his hat to the mat and began painting in that way. How is our time? We're finished.